Okay. All right. How is everybody? This is Aaron Rosari. I'm your philosophy professor. I've never stood in front of a camera before in an empty room and recorded myself talking. So if this comes across a little awkward, that's probably going to be how it is today. But as the semester goes on, I'll warm up to it. It'll be great. Welcome to the class for week 1 at this point. Actually, we're into week 2, sorry. So for week 2, you should have completed your first set of robust reading questions on what is consciousness and what is it like to be a bat by Thomas Nagel, and submitted your answers to Canvas by Thursday night. And remember, I'm not so much grading those for accuracy because we haven't talked about anything yet, as I am just to see that you've gotten into these texts and have done your best to discern what's happening. If you want to do well in this course, best suggestion, take your time with those reading questions, do them thoroughly and well. Open up my document, which becomes available Friday morning, where I answer the questions, compare those answers to your own, make improvements, take relevant notes, and then view videos such as this one. You might be asking, okay, so I've already given in written form responses to the reading questions. What function does this video serve? It's a good question. And on these somewhat short videos, 20 minutes or less, I'm simply trying to give the big picture of the philosophical problem or problems under discussion, provide a little more context so you can kind of place your answers to the specific reading questions in a broader context. Yeah, so to kind of make the content generally more accessible, more interesting, because you can see how things fit together. So all I'm going to do in this video presentation is hit a few of the bigger picture ideas surrounding what philosophers refer to as either the problem of consciousness or the mind-body problem. And let me introduce that with an example. So take about, 10 seconds, close your eyes, and just picture an open field filled with flowers, animals, birds, sunsets, rainbows perhaps, something like that. So I'll count to 10, just kind of imagine that. 6, 7, 8. Okay, so in my live classes, I always ask people, so what did you picture when you pictured this kind of open field? And one thing students say is they had lots of colors, blue, red, green, brown, etc. Of course, they also see or hear maybe some bird chirping noises, things like that. Okay, so lots of sounds. And these are paradigmatic mental states. Even when you're imagining colors and sounds, the rich imagining is something you experience from the first person perspective. And the question is, what are these mental states? Either they're identical to specific brain states. So maybe when you're imagining the green of a tree, maybe that simply is some sort of pattern of neurons firing. Maybe the same is true for the sound a deer makes or something like that. But it doesn't appear to be that way. So why not? Well, first of all, using color Green is a good color to use for this. If a neuroscientist were to crack open your skull and examine your brain, all he or she would see is a uniform, dull gray mass. Okay? There would be no greens, there'd be no blues, there'd be no chirping. Even if you were imagining that the very instant the neuroscientist was examining your brain. So if mental states simply are brain states, it's hard to see how that could be because your mental states have properties that your brain states certainly don't seem to have. So none of your brain states are green. None of them make a chirping noise. None of them are open field shaped. And yet all that was going on in your imagining. The sort of view this supports historically has gone by the name of mind-body dualism, where the mind and mental states, such as experiences of color, experiences of sound, entertaining a thought, these are non-physical entities or states, and they simply interact with the brain. They're not strictly identical to brain states. Thomas Nagel, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? This is basically what he's arguing. He's arguing that these kind of private, first-personal experiences we have are not constituted merely by brain states. Now, the problem of consciousness is a problem because as of now, there aren't any particularly outstanding answers to the question, how does the mind and mental states relate to the brain and brain states? So on the one hand, if you say the mind and mental states, such as seeing blue, hearing noise, entertaining a thought, are not brain states, then they become these really mysterious non-physical things. And since they're non-physical, they're not literally here. So you might want to say things like, well, my thoughts exist here inside my head. But if you're a mind-body dualist, you can't really say stuff like that. Because to be inside anywhere is to have a physical location. And if you yourself are a non-physical mind, having these non-physical states of belief, feeling, sensation, and the like, if you're non-physical, then you're not literally here. So that raises puzzles such as, where are you? But on the other hand, and this is Nagel's point, if mental states really are things like brain states, how is that even possible? Because the mental states have different properties than your brain states. So this is why this is called the mind-body problem, or the problem or mystery of consciousness. It is, as of yet, an unsolved problem. And not only is the problem unsolved, we don't really have a lot of ideas of how to go about solving the problem. Most of the questions you answered this week kind of brought out the problem. So in one of your questions, I forget the numbers off the top of my head, you looked at a thought experiment done by Leibniz. G.W. Leibniz was a German philosopher, co-inventor of calculus with Isaac Newton. They worked separately. One of history's great intellectuals, and he proposed the following thought experiment. So imagine your brain was the size of like an entire building. I think he says a mill, which reflects his time period. So you can kind of walk around inside it. And he says, if you were to do that and see all the patterns of neuronal excitation, different neurons firing in response to various stimuli, you wouldn't have much of a clue about the nature of thought, feeling, sensation, for the same reasons we went over in that initial thought experiment or if you were to close your eyes and imagine all these sensations, you wouldn't describe anything you're imagining using the language of the brain. You wouldn't say, see fiber delta pattern firing in this lobe. Um, Scientists have correlated mental states with brain states. So maybe every time you're in a state of pain, a specific kind of pain, we'll call it mental state 1, maybe that does correlate with a brain state. But when sorry, that just says MS1 for mental state 1, BS1 for brain state 1. So even if those two events are correlated, we describe the mental state of being in pain as having this felt quality of ouchfulness, but we don't use that language to describe the brain. We use, again, more geometric vocabulary, more electricity, excitation patterns, that sort of thing. And the two just seem like night and day different. And Leibniz's thought experiment brings that out. Okay, so what about Nagel? Nagel, his thought experiment is really similar to Leibniz's, except he uses a bat's states of consciousness in comparison with what we can know about a bat brain instead of our own states of consciousness compared to what we know about and how we describe our brain states. So here's Nagel's point. If a bat's experience using echolocation, so kind of squeaks out some sound waves, they bounce back, and the bat uses the bounce back frequencies in order to guide its flight so it doesn't run into anything. Now here, Nagel says this: if the bat's perspective on the world, what it's like to be a bat, were simply analyzable or deducible or identical to a bat's behavior and what's going on in a bat's brain, then if we had full knowledge of what the brain was doing of the bat and could chart rather precisely its various behaviors, the knowledge of the bat's brain and behavior would simply be knowledge of what it's like to be a bat, because they would be the same thing. So if mental states, the experience of what it's like to be a bat, were simply identical to brain states and sets of behavior, then full knowledge of the brain states and the sets of behavior would constitute knowledge of what it's like from the bat's first-person perspective. Okay. But, says Nagel, we could describe what every neuron is doing, every angle the bat takes during flight, every flapping of the wing. And even if we had that third-person description in as much detail as we could possibly muster, we still wouldn't have the foggiest idea of what it's like to experience that flight as the bat. Now, why is this important? So, picture all the different ways the electrical impulses that the bat receives, the sound waves being translated into electrical impulses. Imagine all the ways this could play out in the bat's experiences. So on naval ships, when they ping sound waves off the ocean floor, those bounce back, and a visual representation can be generated so you get a map of the seafloor. So for all we know, the bat in the bat's mind is experiencing something like a visual representation of the world based on those rebounding sound waves. But then again, maybe not. Maybe all the bat experiences is like strong senses or feelings as it approaches an object that it ought to turn rather quickly to avoid the object, or something like that. So maybe the bat only experiences a series of sensations in regards to its private mental life. Maybe bats have a kind of there's other options you could imagine. Maybe the bats see different colors in response to how distant an object is, and then they respond to those colors. Nagel's point is we haven't the foggiest idea what the bat experiences, even though, or even if we had complete knowledge of what's going on in the bat's brain and in the bat's body during flight. And this is strong evidence that whatever constitutes that private experience, it's not simply identical to or reducible to what the bat's central nervous system, especially its brain, is doing. Okay. So again, big picture, the mind-body problem simply is the question, how do our conscious mental states, our mind and the things we experience, how is that connected to the brain? Option one is physicalism. The mind simply is the brain. Being in a certain mental state simply is being in a certain brain state. Another option that we've discussed is mind-body dualism, and I'm simplifying here. There's multiple versions of each of these. Maybe a mental state is a non-physical thing caused by a brain state. So the two are correlated, but they're not simply identical. Nagel adopts that view. He defends that view. But as I mentioned at the beginning, that view has puzzles of its own that make it not the clear winner. If that view is true, your mental states aren't spatially located, so it's hard to understand how they could interact with a physical object like the brain at all. And if not only your mental states aren't physically located, but your and I are non-physical minds interacting with the body, then we would literally be nowhere, and that's a hard pill to swallow. So this is why the problem endures. That's the big picture, and hopefully having this big picture will help you go back into my responses to those reading questions and your own, and kind of put some of those pieces together a little better. Okay, so having consumed this video, having consumed my responses to the reading questions and reflected more yourself, you're in an excellent position to answer the discussion board for this week, which is due both next Monday and next Wednesday. Those are always going to be due in 2 parts. And yeah, hopefully this was helpful. Again, for me, this is a little bit of an experiment. If this wasn't helpful, hopefully reading over my detailed responses to the reading questions are helpful, and hopefully the discussion boards are helpful. So we'll see, a little bit of an experiment, but I hope you've learned some stuff. All right, thank you.